Good evening. Today is February 15, 2021, and this is the 39th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is Al Johnson, a researcher and senior advisory board member of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. Al was also the previous director for Raymond's Challenge, which trains the EOD and SWAT, police, and also military teams from all around the world. With the current turmoil and also the uncertainty that has surrounded the 2020-21 election cycle and the massive paradigm shift that has been seen in the aftermath, most of America is wondering, where are we headed now? On February 1st, I spoke to Al for the first part of the two-part discussion with the Burma coup 3 years to the date, when I had submitted the regional assessment on Southeast Asia, looking at Burma. We ended up shifting out to today's podcast for the second part of our discussion on the new American Proclamation. While many Americans see the inevitability of violence and the desolation of the failure of the courts, law enforcement, and also politicians to investigate and also protect their right to vote, and increasingly their right to free speech, there is a small but significant voice that is saying not all hope is lost, and that if Americans embrace the new American Proclamation, that violence can be avoided, and also a government of the people, by the people, and for the people can once again be a reality. Al, it's good to have you here for the second part of our discussion. As I said again, with what happened in Burma, 3 years to the date in January, when we had the coup, it was necessary that I talked about it. One of our podcasts, and also brought in Mike, who was on the ground with me as we were doing the assessment. And this is thanks to you. And when we were in Thailand, and really kind of negotiating that effort to be able to meet with some of the opposition. And hopefully today we can continue on the second part of the New American Proclamation and try to get our folks caught on to what is the next step forward to fixing our issues domestically here.
Well, it's good to be back, and enjoyed the podcast on Burma with Michael Yon there. So it was important because it not only was something that you had written about 3 years ago, but it was kind of an arcane foreign policy that most people never delve into, and so they didn't have enough data to really judge. Okay, is the new administration, the Biden regime, are they doing good? Are they doing bad? Which way are they going? Because it was really his first test of foreign policy. Everybody was looking toward Iran, but it ended up, Burma kind of surprised everybody in the back. So it was good for you to get that information out there so that people could make assessments of the U.S. foreign policy and see which direction it might be headed in. So that was a good thing. So I'm glad to take a pause and come back. So I appreciate you having me back.
No, it's good to have you back, and I'm glad that the current POTUS actually took steps in order to go ahead and put sanctions on General Helang, who was a favorite of the characters for the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know if we're going to make any changes or differences, to be honest, given the Chinese Communist Party is so well entrenched. And now, unfortunately, in Burma, they have control of the Straits of Malacca, and then all those refugees being poured into Thailand, where we do the training now with Roy when it comes to our next training with the Raymond's Challenge planned for January of 2022, given the COVID issue. I'm not sure if we are on a winning track when it comes to how we're buffering against China, but we'll see. It's all a matter of what the National Security Agency folks decide to do. Unfortunately, you look into their background, and a lot of them have had business interests with China in the past. So it's very difficult, especially when you see a rising economic star, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party, with the money that is investing not just overseas in the Middle East, as I was on a news podcast today, looking at what is happening with Mandarin Chinese in the northern Iraq, actually replacing French, German, and also English because of the business interests that are being shown from the Middle East into Southeast Asia, specifically into China businesses. So hopefully we are able to at least give some guidance to our folks today to try to make some of those changes. I know you put some wonderful slides together for us today, and hopefully that gives us a new vision of this new paradigm that we need to follow, a paradigm shift if we are going to be successful in bringing the United States back from an economic disaster.
True. Well, it's an economic and really a social disaster because, what's been occurring in the U.S. Has been unprecedented. There's a saying sometimes, weeks are like years, years are like decades. And we've been through that period where, 2020 was a year that spanned almost a decade of change. And it seemed to increase, and it seems to keep continuing increasing. And a lot of Americans, I know a lot of people in your audience and other people out there are very fearful. There's a lot of anxiety because that which everyone has taken as their paradigm, their existing paradigm, that this was the way things work. This is what the mechanisms, the safety mechanisms in society and government are there to protect them. When those go away, it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear. And as you know, when people are in that state, and collectively when a lot of people are in that state, it potentially can lead to violence, especially if those mechanisms that are there to redress grievances, that are there to vent frustrations and debate topics and to have that kind of a steam valve, if you will, if those are shut off, the pressure builds and usually violence comes as a result. And so that's probably what we've looked at for quite a while here. And we're looking at, okay, what are the mechanisms to change it? And there is a steam valve. There is a mechanism by which Americans of all levels, from your grandmother up the street to the kids down the hall, everybody can take part in this collectively and actually have a very powerful voice, so to speak. And if you're able, I can put up the slides now and we can start looking at the going over exactly what this is.
Let's go for it.
Yep. So there's a lot of talk right now. So unfortunately there's a group of people that say and we may go to revolution, and unfortunately that is a future that might happen, but we hope not. And there are groups though on all sides that are moving toward that violence. We saw a little bit of it, the low burn this summer, and then some flashpoints. And when the spring comes, as Michael Yon said, that's typically when you have larger outbreaks of violence. So hopefully that won't happen, but you have to be prepared for it. So what do you do? Well, you look at how could you collectively mobilize people that have been silenced and their votes have been taken away and they have no equal access to justice, and how do you get them into a positive direction that actually can make a change? It still has a mechanism, an outlet to make a change, to maintain their freedom, to fight back to get those liberties, which are now slipping away so rapidly, unfortunately. And there are going to be some words in here that may be new for some of your viewers, but I need to kind of contextualize it. So what this really is this is Americanism and a kind of a new American Proclamation. But really what we're doing is we're just reframing the historical trends, the current trends, in a way that's very easy to see. In other words, you're taking a lot of false labels off of things so that people go, aha, now I understand it, I see what I'm looking at, and then they can work toward making it better. Because if you don't look at things the right way, if you have false labels on things, you're never going to solve the problem because you can't understand the problem. But we'll go into that a little bit more. So, and part of that was framed in this little document that a little work group has worked on called the American Proclamation. And really it reframes it. It puts it into the ideas that people have, and then it gives you a very concrete roadmap going forward with, like I said, things that grandma to the kids down the hall can do to be able to win back your freedoms. So next slide. And the first thing is that most people will recognize it because it is literally a reframing of the Constitution. So even though we say it is a new American Proclamation, all it is just reframing your relationship with the Constitution. It re-shows you what that constitutional relationship was, and by clear and accurate meanings, right? And so the beginning, of course, is a preamble. It talks about everything going on. And the thing that Americans need to know is everybody says it's unprecedented, but this is actually precedented. Many times in history, dictators have arose, oligarchs have arose, people have arose that want to crush human freedoms in order to gain control for whatever their end is. It could be political, it could be hubris, it could be economical, but the processes are the same. And so we're going through very similar processes that have occurred throughout history. The same processes that we had in 1776, the same process that we had in a smaller view with a group of, for example, Black Americans in the Civil War, where we had to free them. Those same processes are going through right now. And so that's what this is. So next slide. And then in the back, of course, there's some steps that you can do. And then next slide. And the biggest thing that people need to remember, and I love this quote by Carl Sagan. It's been out there. I'm sure people have probably read it. And then it ties into the terms of your show. So when people get into a truth, especially if some figure in authority tells them what something is, they get comfortable and they can't break free of the lie that they've been living in to say, okay, this is the truth. This is accurately what's going on. We still have people out there that believe that the earth is flat, no matter how much evidence you show to them. You have, people that believe what they want to believe despite evidence, to the contrary. And so the hardest thing for people to do is to acknowledge that, oh man, I've been fooled, I've been tricked. And to move forward. This last year, 2020, was almost like, 2020 vision, right? It clarified in people's minds, things that we had been so long believing didn't occur. How many people noticed that so many in the Republican Party really weren't those kind of Republicans they thought? How many people on the Democrat side said, oh wow, the Democrats weren't what we thought? How many people thought, well, Google is for free speech, and these platforms are for free speech, and then they take that away. So really, part of this process that you go through in the American Proclamation is looking at the truth with clear eyes and reframing things so that you can understand it in very clear terms and then move forward. So next slide. And there's a saying that I love that I operate by, and it's been very effective. And it's basically this, that organizational structure dictates the outcome. And that is a maxim that has been true for as long as I've been, operating within all sorts of organizations. And we're talking even biological organizations up to governmental and regional and global organizations. The way that it's structured dictates the outcome. And therefore, the organizational structure should dictate the label. And this is the biggest problem we've got in modern society right now, especially America, is we will label things that are in no way related to their organizational structure. And to illustrate that, we've got this little cat right there. And if you want to call the cat a shoe, right? I put it on the floor, it's next to a shoe, I'm calling the cat a shoe. I guarantee you, if you try to tie that thing onto your feet, you're not going to run the marathon. The results are going to be terrible. Your feet are going to be scratched up. It's going to be loud. It's going to be noisy. It's not going to act like a shoe. I don't care how much you call it a shoe. That cat is not a shoe. It's not going to have the same outcome. So you're going to keep trying to replicate using it like a shoe because you're calling it a shoe. And the results are going to be catastrophic, pardon the pun. And so we have to look at the organizational structure. This thing is not organizationally structured like a shoe. It's organizationally structured like a cat. Therefore, I got to call it a cat. And once I've identified that, now I can deal with the problem, right? I'm not going to use the cat for a shoe. I'm going to use the shoe for a shoe. And that's what we've got on a macro level in our society. We're calling things by names that are incorrect. We have euphemisms for just about everything. And then when we try to solve the problem, it's just like putting a cat on your feet, trying to walk on it like a shoe. It's just going to tear you up and you can't understand why. So the first step in any process moving forward is correctly identifying and labeling what these organizational structures are and moving forward in that. And so that's what we're going to go over real quick, and then we'll get more into the proclamation for that. So next slide. And the first thing is Americanism. And some people will be familiar with this. If you're in the American Legion, for example, or some veterans organizations, or a historian, you may understand Americanism, but most people won't understand it. Most people understand this as classic liberalism, as conservatism, as republicanism. They'll have different names for it, but really it's about Americanism because, as you know, words change over time because there was classic liberalism, but then it got co-opted and it became liberalism. And liberalism went from being what's called right wing to left wing. So people get confused in the terminology. But really, Americanism defines that which most people before this that were called conservatives or classical liberals or Republicans believed. And Americanism is the belief that all individuals are endowed with rights inherently from birth, right? Not the government. So you're born with these rights. And this is a fundamental principle. And so when people say, for example, that Republicans or conservatives, believe in slavery or they want slavery, they want, not equal rights, that's not true. If you're an American, you believe that these rights, you're born with them and that the government is simply there to protect you or protect those rights. It's not there to bequeath the rights to you. The government doesn't give you rights. It comes from outside the government. The government's just a caretaker to ensure that your rights are not taken away by someone else, including the government. And then the rights can only be taken away if your actions violate another person's rights. And that's another person, not necessarily the government. So a right has to be taken away. You have to be infringing on someone else's rights. And then, even then, you have to go through a due process. There's a legal process that you go through, and then it's the minimally invasive. If my rights are going to be curtailed, it must be to the minimum extent possible in order to ensure the other person has their rights. And that is the basis of Americanism. And there's some other things that go into there, some rights that all filter into that. But that's the foundational principle of American, that all people, it doesn't matter your background, your race, your religion, it doesn't matter your gender, I don't care where you came from, you are born with these rights. And those rights are given to you not by the government, and therefore they cannot be just arbitrarily taken away by the government or by an agency working for the government in some capacity. And so that's the bottom line of what Americanism is. And so you can be technically a Democrat, and if you believe in these principles, you believe in Americanism. You're still good. And we can remember Democrats that used to be there. I mean, we'll get a little bit later to it with Tulsi Gabbard, and there was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, some of the classical Democrats. But lately, unfortunately, the people have been radicalized that core principle is gone from many people in both sides of the political parties. Both Democrat and Republicans have forgotten this core truth, which is the foundation of the Constitution, which is the foundation of our society that we call America. And the mechanisms that we need to ensure these rights, first and foremost, is justice, right? An equal access and equal treatment of justice. Not that we have a justice system. It's not enough that you establish a court. It must be in the system that the court protects all rights equally, and that you have equal access to it. And lately we've seen, of course, that's gone away. The Justice Department does not investigate all crimes equally. If you've seen, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop, that had enough evidence on that there should have been raids right away. I mean, there was enough in there. The Child Protective Services should have, put some flags up there. There's a lot in that was not done. And yet they would go investigate, somebody that made a tweet, right? A meme in 2016, they raided that guy's house. That is not equal protection under the law. There are two standards of justice. Again, the list is long. Hillary Clinton's email server, hundreds, I think it was actually like 1,000 cases of violations of OPSEC in that. But yet a Marine, officer went to jail for one violation that was much more minor. It was inadvertently took something home and it wasn't double packaged, right? So if you don't have that, you're beginning to erode those individual rights. It must be equal access to the law and equal treatment under the law. We fought a civil war for that. We fought civil rights in the 60s for that. And unfortunately, that lesson is lost today, and we don't have that mechanism. So we need to get that back. The second one, which is very important, is free speech. And free speech means, of course, open debate and on unpopular topics. And I would point people, I'm a historian, I love history. Frederick Douglass, in his 1860 speech in Boston, absolutely pointed out that without slavery is only possible if there is no free speech. If you have free speech, you can no longer have slavery. And that was a fundamental principle by which he fought, and that we must always remember. Because without open debate, without being able to debate the topics when and where you need to, you can become, in effect, enslaved. When you're silenced, you're enslaved. And we have to remember that's a fundamental principle. Everybody has that right. Not just a few people that have, that are CEOs sitting on, corporate chairs somewhere in Silicon Valley, only their right to be heard. Only politicians that are voted for, they are the only ones that need to be heard. No, everyone has a right to be heard. Now, I don't have to agree with it. I can debate you on it, and that is my right to debate you. We are all equal in that, and that we can debate each other openly on it. And some ideas will be unpopular and uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean that they should not be debated. As you remember, civil rights at one time was an unpopular and an uncomfortable topic. Equal rights for Black Americans was an unpopular and an uncomfortable topic. Slavery was an unpopular and uncomfortable topic, but it needed to be debated. It needed to be addressed, and it needed to be, worked on. And that's what we need back, is that free speech. And that's probably the biggest thing that we've lost, aside from the free press. And again, going over to the next one, free press. You have to be able to get facts in there. And right now, we have these CDOs, is what I call them, corporate disinformation outlets. It's no longer news media. And the Americans, by and large, are consistently not getting a lot of facts. We saw this in the closing arguments of this second impeachment, or I don't know if it's an impeachment legally, but it was kind of a show trial in Congress, where the defense attorney, simply said, look, This is probably the first time that most Americans have heard the full speech, the full speech that then President Trump had given. And the characteristic, the nature of that topic is such that half of the country is ready to fight the other half of the country because of information being withheld. You're beginning to radicalize groups of people, and you well know the radicalization process. We've seen it in the Middle East. And one of the best ways to make radicals is to control the flow of information to them, to control what they see so that they don't understand the other side, they don't debate the other side. There is no open dialogue. I shut down dialogue between the two groups. I create completely different social groups. I create completely different cultures in some ways, and the information flow is different. And I can get these two, they dehumanize each other as time and time again, and they'll start going at it. And so there's no longer a free press. There's very few outlets now that are free. They're all corporate owned, and those corporations have a vested interest in a political shaping exercise, it looks like. As Time magazine has kind of pointed out, that's what a lot of this was oligarchs moving it, and they tend to control the press. So a free and independent press is definitely needed. And so, without that, it becomes very difficult to do that. And the ability to question, to hold the government accountable is supposed to be a role of the press. But it is failed because it's only holding a certain ideology accountable, not the whole government on behalf of the people. So it needs to be an advocate for the people against the government to ensure the people's rights. That was why we had a free press. Not a free press because you can make profits, and not a free press because, hey, it's a cool bumper sticker. The free press mechanism is there to protect individuals' rights from the government because it would hold the government accountable to the people's interest. And that's something we've forgotten, but needs to come back. And then, of course, assembly, the right to assemble, so that we can come together and we can debate these ideas, we can talk about these ideas, and we can do actions to ensure our rights, because collectively we're much stronger than we are individually. And today, it's kind of interesting, that means cyber, right? So we can collectively come together on social media in our freedom to assemble and do that. But what's happened recently, for example, at the walkaway movement, which was about 500,000 minorities had openly said, I'm voting for, the Republican Party. I'm voting for, conservatism. Americanism really is what they're doing. And they all formed a big social group on Facebook, and Facebook arbitrarily just censored them, silenced them. They're gone. And so they have denied, in some ways, they've denied them the freedom to assemble, right, in cyberspace. So we have to look at, where is that infringement? The COVID mechanisms right now, right? Nobody's being able to assemble. You can't really, you shouldn't get together because, the government regulations. So that's kind of an interesting one to look at, and we should not forget that. The right to vote, I don't need to go into that one. That's been all out there. We need definitely transparent elections, because without, very, very visible election integrity, you don't know, the process is gone. And it needs to be one person, one vote, not a corporation, can sway the vote one way or the other. One person, one vote, and then let the system run as it should with the republic, that sort of thing. And then the final thing, all of those go together, is because all are equal. All Americans have the same rights. There should not be one class that gets one more right than the others. All Americans have the same rights. That's why it is equal rights, and it's in the Constitution. We fought a war for it. We need to keep remembering that. But that's the way society, unfortunately, is moving, is that there's a political class and an oligarch class that is held to a different standard, that have more rights than others. And it shouldn't be. So next slide. And then if those seem familiar, they are, because that's basically the Constitution. But for whatever reason, I've browsed through a couple of public school from California. They have some online courses. Everybody's putting their stuff online. And it was absolutely frightening to me in that nobody was teaching the Constitution. Nobody was teaching you that this is the contract by which all of the people, right? It's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We have a contract. And that contract is the Constitution, which guarantees my rights, your rights, everyone's rights to be protected. But they're not teaching that anymore. And some would claim that may be intentional. And I think we need to get back to that, to realize that the Constitution is a legal contract that binds us together, and it's supposed to bind the government to how it's supposed to do its operation. And we hear a lot of people say the Constitution, but they don't really look at what are the articles within it and what does it mean. So next slide. So Americanism. Now, this is the important part, because you'll hear a lot this summer, for months and months and months, there was a little group out there called Antifa, which is supposed to be anti-fascist. And they said, we're the good guys, and, we're going to beat up veterans. We're going to beat up Americans. We're going to beat up everybody. We're going to hit people that are sitting there dining out because we're anti-fascist. And so they said, with conservatives and Republicans, they're fascists and that sort of thing. Well, that's nonsense. These are false labels that are put onto everything. So Americanism believes very simply, individual rights, limited government, multi-party system, a constitution-based, law-based, right? Law and order. It's peaceful, right? The ultimate goal is a peaceful and better world. And the economy should be free, right? You have a free economic basis at the foundation of it. And that's Americanism, right? And ranged against that is something called socialism. And socialism in all its varieties. And that includes Nazism, fascism, and communism. Those are the same sides of the coin. It's a false dichotomy to say that communism is opposed to Nazism. So therefore, if I fight Nazism but I support communism, I must be a good guy. No, that's absolutely false. Americanism believes in those individual rights. Socialism believes that the rights come from the state. The individual has no rights except that which the state loans them or not, right? There is nothing outside the state, whereas Americanism believes in limited government. It's a government of, by, and for the people to caretake our rights, but collectively we're part of it. The socialism believes that nothing is outside of the state. Everything from your medical to your culture to your language to your food to how you raise your kids to everything is within the state. Nothing is outside of the state. Nothing is non-political, right? They believe in big government. Socialism will also notice it's one party. We have to be careful here because it's one functional party. You can look like you have a two-party system, but if they all operate in concert to protect the government's interest, it's a one-party system. That's why you'll hear me sometimes, I'll use the term uniparty repub, which is the Republicans that are Republicans in name only, the so-called rhinos, but it's a uniparty because technically they're acting as one party with the larger majority now, which is the Democrats. And so you have to be careful that even though the name is there, how they vote and how they function is different. They're also ruling party, power-based versus constitution. So whichever ruling party is in or whoever has the most power, they get to set the rules. That's socialism. Socialism also believes in a constant struggle. They don't believe in a better world. They say that even though that they're going to create utopia, that the government will create a utopia, there will always be a struggle. Therefore, we always have to have these rules in place to control you because there's always going to be this conflict. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And of course, the controlled economic basis, that there is a planned economy, that the government controls the economy because the government controls everything. So, and keep in mind that Americanism is absolutely incompatible with and diametrically opposed to socialism in all its forms, which is communism, Nazism, fascism, and 1,000 other little isms in there. So keep that in mind. So next slide. And then this one is, again, some people will try to nitnoid with little nuances about how Nazism is not socialism or fascism is not socialism, and or communism is its own little thing. It's not true. In other words, if you fundamentally look at it, the constant struggle that the state creates in order to maintain its control, the only difference between the three, when you look at them, when you read the writings, when you look at their policies that they actually implemented, the only nuance is what is the nature of that struggle. Communists believe that it's economic-based. Nazis believe it's race-based. Fascists said that any historical event, any event can be a cause of struggle. That's it. That is all there is. If you read Mussolini, he wrote literally the doctrine of he had a manifesto of fascism in 1919. He wrote the doctrine of fascism in 1932, and he went in detail. His only beef with Bolshevism, as he called it, which was communism, his only beef with it was that it believed that the only cause of struggle was economics, and he said everything can be an economic struggle. That's it. Everything else, government programs, pretty much they're the same, and that's what as Americans we need to understand. So next slide. And then all of them use a form of Marxism. And this is where the social media and the corporate disinformation outlets really get hold of us. Also, we've seen it in academia where they weaponize language in order to deceive and subjugate the masses. That's pretty much Marxism is. It's a tool that you can use to put false labels on things. So if I can mislabel things, you don't know what that organizational structure really is, and you can't do any mechanisms to combat against it and to set up your own organizational structure to protect your rights. And so that's what Marxism is. And everybody can use a form of Marxism. It's pretty prevalent now. So, that's my favorite little cartoon down there. And it basically says, oh, it's okay. Look at this label on my arm, right? The Antifa label. Oh, okay, it's okay. So that's kind of the trap that we've set ourselves in. We've been bamboozled, as Carl Sagan had said, into believing a certain thing, and we don't open our eyes up and say, okay, well, what actually is this guy doing? What actually is this organization doing? We look at the label and we think, well, that's okay. We don't have to worry about it. And so that's why we go through this little exercise to kind of train ourselves in that and to get the right perspectives. Next slide. And pretty much there it is. It's what we talked about. And we also oppose the Marxism used to promote socialism, and that's why it's very important to have free speech and a free press. Because with Marxism, free speech and an actually independent and free press is the best weapon against Marxism. Because when you can debate a false label, when you can openly debate something that's been labeled falsely, it tears that down. But if you cannot debate it, Marxism is a very powerful tool. Education is a very powerful tool against Marxism. So keep that in mind. All right, next slide. And as we said before, forget this, left and right and Republican and Democrat and conservative and liberal, because liberal, even that has been, co-opted and changed, and it continues to change. Really what it is you're either, for the socialism camp, we really have this, moving very strongly now in the U.S. It's pretty much there. But you can be a Democrat and be an Americanism. You believe in an Americanism. For example, Tulsi Gabbard, believes in individual liberties and rights. She believes that, government should be less intrusive in some areas within, the American life. So she believes in the tenets of Americanism, even though she has a D by her name. She's a Democrat. And it used to be that way. People remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a good politician that, anti-communist, did not like communism, was very strongly against it. He believed in equal rights for everyone. He didn't believe in, setting things up, and he was accurate in labels. He took a lot of fire for it, especially in the Johnson administration. He took a lot of fire for being very, very honest about what he came to. But he had his foundational principles. He just he disagreed with Republicans on the degree of which some of the government functions were to be targeted to. But he still believed in the fundamental principles of Americanism, which is individual rights. So forget the Democrat, forget the Republican, look at that individual and how they vote. The counter to that, kind of the evil side of it, so Tulsi Gabbard's the good side, the evil side of that is Mitt Romney. How many people were totally surprised this year by Mitt Romney and the way that he went? He absolutely was big government, and you should have known that, because earlier he had his version of Obamacare, the Romney Care, which was basically again, the government, nothing outside the state. So he wanted healthcare, which is a huge industry, in the state's purview, in the state's control, and the state benefiting even more from revenues and power and influence from that industry. And so he very much was a fascist in that regard. And even though he was a Republican, even though he ran for president of the entire Republican Party, he does not support the views of Americanism. He supports the views of socialism. He does not want transparent elections. He didn't fight for transparent elections. He covered it up. He does not want free speech. He does not want free and transparent debate. He does not want a free press. This man, for all intents and purposes, should be, just sitting on the left side of Nancy Pelosi. But because he says, I'm a Republican, and he was voted in a conservative state that was looking at the label, they weren't looking at how this guy is organizationally structured, right? That's the key. So when you look at him, they put a label on him, Republican, and what do Republicans do? Oh, I'm going to vote for him because he's a Republican. No, look at what he does. How is he organizationally structured? What organizational structures does he put in place? And then make your judgment about that. So, next slide. Now, as I said, stop using euphemisms. These are my pet peeves, and I'm sure, Sargis, at the end of this, you could probably, add a lot more to these. But the first one that you hear is mainstream media. That's a ridiculous euphemism. Because there's nothing mainstream about it. 78 to 80 million people, disagree with the news. I mean, vehemently disagree with the news, because, we had, there's basically 5 corporations that run over 90% of American media. And it was a constant, for 4 years, it was a constant barrage of absolute, things that were not able to debate. People were censored. For example, the Russiagate. Absolutely, prima facie was wrong. There was nothing in that passed the smell test. You weren't allowed to dig into it. People were silenced because of it. And so we saw this, 4 years ago, again, with Russiagate. People were being silenced about, talking about the CCP. Sargis, you remember when you were being silenced because you correctly looked at the fact pattern and said, hey, there's a big chance that this thing came from a Wuhan P4 laboratory, and people were censoring you. There were editors that nope, I don't think I want to print this thing, and so it's not mainstream media. There's nothing mainstream about it. It does not reflect mainstream America any more than the crazy guy with a Napoleon hat up the corner does, right? So the correct terminology is what they are. The organizational structures, these are corporate disinformation outlets. They're owned by corporations, massive conglomerate corporations that, as I said, the Time magazine article has showed are very political. And they are not putting out news. They're not putting out information or facts. They are there to put out basically disinformation. And most of it's opinion pieces. The reporter gets on there. He has an emotional appeal rather than showing you facts in an impartial way that let you decide. Walter Cronkite is long dead. So the other one, as I said before, don't use Democrat. We talked about that one. Use Americanism versus socialism is much better because you can get some good Democrats and you can get some really evil Republicans like, Mitt Romney. The other one, this is another one of my favorites, Antifa, right? Anti-fascist. That's a euphemism because they are fascist, right? You're changing it again. Go back and read Mussolini's own books on his own writings on fascism, and it was a will to power, using street violence to circumvent democracy, to subvert democracy to the will of the people through violent conflict. That is exactly what Antifa does. So I don't care what label you put on yourself. If your actions are something completely opposite than that, then that's the label you should be. So Antifa, I always say euphemistically called Antifa because they're not Antifa, they're actually fascist. And if they're race-based, as you saw that chart earlier, if race is the point of your contention, then technically you're a Nazi. So, and again, so-called BLM because they're really not for what they say they're for. The other one I say is don't use big tech. Big tech is, even though they are big tech, that just makes it sound like there are some big company like Ford Motor Cars or GM used to be, or IBM used to be back in the day, and that they're doing what they do because they're so huge corporations. Well, they're not. They're very politicized, and they are basically a right-hand organization to the government, so that the government circumvents this whole Second Amendment. Right? Once everybody's on it, there's a nuance there. So the government works with big tech, or what I call fasc tech. Fasc tech works with the government, and that's why I call it fasc tech, which is fascist tech. So some people call it deep tech, which technically you could say, but that sounds too much like the deep web, which is kind of an open, unregulated internet. So it has some connotations that's kind of like, well, not really. So fasc tech really is what big tech should be called if you're looking accurately at as the organization functions. Especially as they silenced, hundreds of thousands of voices, during an election cycle, and they're the arbiters, the final arbiters of truth. Well, that's definitely fascist, right? So next slide. Now for the meat of it. So now that you understand kind of what the playing field is, you think, well, you and I talked earlier before the show about how it used to be within, the Hasidic community, right, Orthodox community. If there was people that, the politicians that weren't doing their job or they were doing something bad, collectively, the Hasidic community would come together, the Orthodox would come together, and they would say, look, we as a big block of people are not going to vote for you. And usually it was a powerful block. They all voted, pretty well when we got mobilized, and we could affect the change, right? And that used to be the way it was. But after November, does anybody have any guarantee of security that that's going to work anymore, right? When, as again, the Time magazine article admitted, a big group of people can simply buy their way into an election, right? So what chance do I have to be able to affect it? Well, the good news is that 78 to 80 million Americans have a very powerful advantage that the other people in these color revolutions didn't. Unfortunately, the people in Egypt don't have a lot of economic power, right? Individually or even as a collective group. All the Egyptians boycotting something isn't really going to make a dent in anything. Czech Republic, anywhere you go, wherever there was a color revolution or an attempted color revolution, those people didn't have a lot of economic power. 78 to 80 million Americans, and probably more now that you've seen, the Biden regime in action, can band together and have a tremendous economic impact. And that is something that was not factored into any of these color revolutions by Cohen. So the first part that you can do is very simple. And again, like I said, grandma to everybody, get off Twitter, get off Facebook, get off Instagram, get off YouTube, and don't follow links to these places. Don't follow links, because when you click on it, when you engage in it, even a through click. So, once you get your profiles off, but if you click somebody that sends you a link to these things, they're getting money from it, right? Because they can say, look, we've got 4 billion interactions, right, per month. And they get ad revenue from it, and people invest in them because of that interaction, and they have power because of it. If everybody leaves, they become like MySpace. MySpace has no political power whatsoever. It's kind of a punchline, right? Because why? Nobody's on it anymore, right? Who cares? So we have to keep remembering, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, ooh, sounds big and they seem official. They're doing fact checks and they have these boards. They're Taco Bell. We wouldn't let Taco Bell or Sears have this kind of power, right? And Sears is gone now, but Taco Bell, right? Why would Taco Bell tell me what I can and can't say in their restaurant? I go in to order a burrito and I say, hey, you know what? I think this tax policy is bad. And they slap a sticker on my mouth and say, you can't say that. And then they kick me out of Taco Bell. What? This is ridiculous, right? So stop going there. And you got to stop it. And if you're part of a church, I know you're a member of the Assyrian community, which has a very, very, strong and cohesive church group. It's a good religious community organization that's been around for a long time. You've been through this in Iran with the Iranian Revolution. Don't have, if you've got a church group and they've got a Facebook page, get off it. And there's alternatives out there. There's a lot of alternatives out there. You can go on, Gab, Telegram, there's Gab TV, Odyssey, Rumble. There's lots of other alternatives to these platforms you can go to. Don't use any Google product, right? Google is probably one of the main players that's not talked about here. If you type in a search into Google and you type in a search into another search engine, you'll see Google will censor it. Google will lead you to a negative article. For example, if you type in Trump, it'll give you 10 negative articles before you ever get to one positive article. And they knew this. They had their struggle session 4 years ago and figured out that they did not want Americans getting free access to information. They needed to shape the minds and control the thought processes. And that's what they do. That's their whole raison d'etre right now. So use Brave browser, get off Google browser, go on Brave, use DuckDuckGo for your search engine. And pro tip for those guys that, want to get technically savvy, Android is about 80% Google, and you can change your phone to something called Lineage OS. And you're break free, and you'll be surprised your battery actually goes up. So I did the switch, and I went from like a 6-hour battery life to 2 days of battery life, because Google is pinging where I'm at. It's sending my information everywhere. And again, if they want to silence you, no, don't be a part of the problem. Don't pay the hand that wants to enslave you. Don't pay the hand that will silence you. And that's the biggest thing that Americans can do right now. Stop paying those hands. Look at other companies, right? Bed Bath & Beyond wanted to silence Mike Lindell because he's questioning the election. Well, of course you can question it. You should be, right? Everybody can question anything, right? That's your right. You can question everything, right? What happened to the days of, question authority? Remember that? Apparently that went out the window. Right now it's all fascist. Just listen to what the state says with the official truth. Individually, don't be quiet. Learn, debate, discuss. Don't listen to these CDOs. That are out there. So like I said, 90% of American media is owned by about 5 companies right now, 5 or 6 companies. And they are active political entities. They are technically fascist because they're in bed with one political party. The only one I've seen right now that I can say is fairly independent is Epoch Times. But find your own, go out there and look, do your own due diligence, your judgment, your look at it. Shows like yours are pretty good. A lot of the guys that tend to get banned or shadow banned from YouTube tend to be very good. But again, do your due diligence, double down on them. Guys like Michael Young, find out and stick with those that are pretty good at evaluating information and getting good information. Cell phone companies, you're kind of stuck because there's only 3 in the United States. But one thing you can do is Patriot Mobile. So even though they use like AT&T and Verizon, they take the profit and they put it into good causes, Americanism causes. So you've kind of nullified the money that the bad guys are going to use for it. So that's an option. And these are very simple. I mean, look at this. Nothing in this is nothing that you can't do. 10 years ago, nobody was on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, right, or YouTube, right? I mean, how has that come to be a necessity for life now, especially when there are options out there? Gab, Telegram, Odyssey, Rumble, all that. So it's very easy to get these off. You can move. I've done it. It's easy enough to do. And everybody can do it. It's just they don't want to sometimes because it's comfortable and it's convenient. But the alternative is if we don't get this back now, if we don't, by our dollars, cause a shift in these companies, it could be very dangerous because it could be violence. So next slide. And actually, if we go to the poster now, I got that one final one that was in there. If we could hit the poster, that'd be good because I did want to touch real quickly on, as a bonus for your audience, I wanted to touch real quick on Fash Tech. There it is. So this is an important concept because the economics. So you think these are huge groups and they dominate the market. So Facebook, you see it up there. It's 68% of U.S. adults are on Facebook. 2.8 billion users. Google has over 96% of dominance in the search market. Twitter is millions of users, like 160 plus million a day. So these are very powerful companies, but they have most of their dollars come from investments. So some of it's from ads, which is when you click and when you go on there. So this is kind of a pro tip. So a lot of people in your audience will have retirement funds, right? So they'll do investment funds to retire, or they do a 401k through their employer. So once you've done the normal thing, so you get the whole family off Facebook, you get your church group off of Twitter, you move to alternate tech platforms that are not fascist. Then what you do is you can look at these retirement funds and see if they have, for example, Vanguard. Now, this is about, in some of the cases like Twitter, they have a majority stake in Twitter. I mean, billions of dollars invested in Twitter. So get your money out of that. If you have a Vanguard, a Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, State Street, ClearBridge, and SSGA are the big investors in the tech, pull your funds out of those retirements, and that's going to hit Facebook pretty hard. That's going to hit Twitter pretty hard if you move out in those two ways. So there's two levels to this, kind of the basic level, everybody get off it, grandma gets off it, the kids get off it. But the pro tip for your audience out there for those retirement funds, check your portfolios. And if you've got, Vanguard, Morgan Stanley, or BlackRock, or State Street, find out where your dollars are going and, move those funds around. Make sure they're not getting invested in there. And especially Vanguard. Now, some of the others are political, so they'll put the money in there no matter what. They'll take a loss, right? So we've seen companies now that would rather take a loss because they're going to get a political gain later on because they get money from the government or there's some, quid pro quo there. But for example, Vanguard is actually index led. So with a Vanguard investment fund, they literally just follow the index. So if Twitter starts to become not viable, if Facebook becomes not viable because nobody's on it, and then people are starting to boycott the advertisers on it, then they'll move the funds. The Vanguard funds will automatically move. And Vanguard is a majority stakeholder in Twitter. And I also believe Facebook, it's one of the majority stakeholders in Facebook. So if we take out the money from these guys, then they're just the crazy guy up the street. Right? Zuckerberg will not be able to take his $500 million and, set up an infrastructure to rig the election, right? Or excuse me, fortify it. It was the euphemism, right? The Time magazine article, they're fortifying democracy. Take the label off. They rigged the election. So if he doesn't have $500 million in pocket change to go out and do this hobby, guess what? We might get our democracy back, actually. And that's the real way that you fortify democracy, is you put it back into the hands of the people, because it was a government of, by, and for the people, not the oligarchs, not the fash tech guys, and definitely not the political class. And that's really what we need to start looking at. It's very easy to do. All it takes is just sending that information to everyone that you know, especially, like I said, your associations, your church groups, your veterans halls, your veteran posts, all that kind of thing. And there we go. And that is the best way to avoid violence, because that's something you can actively and constructively do, and it will actually have an impact. Because if those big companies weren't there, your democracy moves back, and then your vote starts to count again. Because you can hit them that support it, and that can support a company like Smartmatic, Dominion, and all those sorts of things. And the way the money moves around, you stop that money flow for these groups. It'll go a long way to giving rights back to individuals. So thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I talked a bit much there, but it's kind of a topic near and dear to my heart.
Look, you always do a yeoman's work with the Near East. God bless. We have a very good, talented group of individuals who are on the board of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. And when I set it up on September 11 in 2014, it was specifically to get to this point that we do what we can in order to secure our democracy, especially this nation as a whole. And we as Americans, regardless of where you come from the political aisle, we have to do our piece. Look, we've given these various different social media outlets the opportunity to be able to set themselves straight. Unfortunately, a lot of them have chosen not to. Now, people will say, well, New Paradigms does also go on Facebook and has the podcast that is on Facebook. We've been working through a process of transitioning ourselves. Some stuff may not happen overnight, but you have to take the active measures to be able to get to where we are today. We do have an ability to go to Rumble. We do go on Telegram. We have other platforms that we have these discussions. But one thing I like about the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement in the company is that what we provide is basically information to be able to support what Al just went through and put together. Literally, major companies would charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to give you this vision of how we can move the United States forward domestically. Literally, you wrote a domestic policy for the U.S. And we presented it today on the New Paradigm show as for free for our audience to look at and move forward, because as Americans, we got to make sure that we do our due diligence for this nation. Now, I do want to kind of touch upon a couple of things. Look, and I go back to the historical election of 1864. 1864 was a significant election for Abraham Lincoln to win his second term. If Abraham Lincoln had not won his second term, it wouldn't have mattered what Sherman was doing on the battlefield or what Grant was doing on the battlefield. We knew eventually that the South was going to lose regardless. And in that particular process, it was going to maybe take 4 years for it to happen, or 5 years, but it was finally going to get to an end point. If Lincoln had lost, this country would have been completely different. They probably would have been under a democratic organizational structure for administration. They probably would have been a peace agreement with the South, and it doesn't matter how well the Northern Army was doing on the battlefield. We probably would have had a different country. So the problem is with 2020 and 2021. Because of the way the election kind of won itself out. And I was an individual who actually ran in Illinois. And I saw how the votes were being cast and counted, how we were going up and down, 5,000, 3,000, coming back up 200. It was an absolute ridiculous way of trying to go through an electoral process. You have in India, we have 1.8 billion people. They all show up on one day, show their ID, vote, and there's no issues. With almost 2 billion people. United States, for whatever reason, we have decided that we have to have an election that starts almost 3 weeks out. If you want to call them the mail-in ballots, almost another 2 weeks prior to that. So you're looking at months of electoral process with the possibility of having individuals just, if you want to say that they're not doing their wants and desires, to sway the election to their favorite candidate because they control the levers that allow for those countings. They may do it indirectly with the mistakes that take place with various different standards and requirements that are out there that are being used in whatever state that you might be living in. So I think for us to be able to take back the country, is very important that we understand that their organizational structures are out there and the dynamics within those organizations, and how those organizations sometimes morph into what we might be calling today, some people would call a deep state. Those organizational structures sometimes are because of the organizational dynamics that are in the position where they are today. And the steps that we take will curtail them from being able to expand themselves beyond what they were supposed to be. In this case, social media outlets were supposed to be nothing more than social media outlets. The example I can give is the National Security Council. When it was initially established, it was established to be able to, it was 6 deep, and it was established to be able to bring the Department of Defense, Department of State together, take a look at certain issues on foreign policy within a specific country of importance, maybe to the United States, to be able to see if they could maybe consolidate the disagreements that existed between the Department of Defense, Department of State, and other U.S. agencies to be able to resolve what the foreign policy for that particular country should be. And under Bush Jr., it went to 200 people. Under Obama, it went to 400, and started writing policy for the various different countries, and got us to a point where we were involved in the Middle East to where we destroyed our economy. We lost a lot of treasure. I know, Al, you and me have lost friends downrange. Why? Because an organization that was initially established to resolve the differences between internal agencies to the United States government by organizational dynamics became this big, huge entity where it finally started having political appointees at the head of some of those departments, which got influenced by lobby groups. And now a deep state was created because of how money flows through DC. So a lot of the things that we see today and what Al is recommending through the Near East is very simple. Take what you can reach out and touch. And what you can reach out and touch is the simplicity of what you can affect as individual Americans for the betterment of being able to take back our country. We're not asking much. We're giving you the information and the resources of what you could do. It is up to you to take those active steps. And I think by doing this, we are going to be able to reset some of the systems that we had. Look, as I mentioned, the National Security Council and the role it played under the Trump administration, because he didn't fill a lot of the positions. He simply didn't have trust in how the system was designed. It became smaller. And even under Biden now, with Biden coming in completely on a different focus point than the previous POTUS, it has even become a little bit smaller from what it used to be. So it is possible that over various different administrations, whether it's Democratic, Republican, if you just take the simplest steps as Americans, we're probably going to have a much more of an effective leverage over these particular organizations that sometimes we believe we will not be able to reach out and touch over a longer period of time, and maybe hopefully reset the system. But this is the way ahead as far as what we're proposing. Al, you did an outstanding job again as far as breaking it down for our folks. With that said, I'm going to give you the last word before we sign off.
Oof. I think you said it all right there. So it's just, this is what you can do at your level, and then collectively get with your organizations and work toward it. And that's pretty much all you can do from here. And then keep hoping that, work for a peaceful return back to, a free society where individual liberties and rights are guaranteed.
That's it. Thank you very much, Al. God bless you. And for our listeners, we are going to have this on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement site. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. And if you need us to talk to you about it in the future, do not hesitate. Get a hold of us through our PR out of the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. We are going to also post this on Facebook, but I guarantee you we shadow ban. But we will give them another choice. Let's see. Let's see what Sony Music Entertainment will say about this particular podcast again. Okay, Al, God bless. Thank you for being here, buddy. We'll have you on.
Oh, thank you very much.
Again.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure.
With that said, there's new paradigms.